Welcome everyone to the launch webinar for the Not the Nobel campaign. Hopefully people have read a bit about this, but basically the idea that it is now 50 years of Nobel Economics Prize winners, and we want to use this opportunity both to raise questions about legitimacy of the Nobel Prize and its impacts, and also to start a process where people can actually nominate people who they think are providing the sort of fresh thinking we need to address the challenges of the 21st century. So this evening we've got an hour, and we're going to start with two presentations, brief presentations from Steve Keen, who I think people are probably very familiar with. He wrote the best-selling book Debunking Economics, and was one of the people who saw the crash coming and has been a trenchant critic of neoclassical mainstream economics. Stephany Griffith-Jones, who is emeritus professor in the US now, and has worked on the economics of financial regulation. She's written a major book with Joe Stiglitz on the need for a visible hand, rather than actually relying on the invisible hand, and much else besides. So we're very lucky to have her here and actually working so we can hear her. And after they've started the discussion, people will then be able to raise their hand. Now, if you go to the Manage Participants button in the center, you should be able to click on that and choose to raise your hand sort of electronically. I will then go to people and ask them to is there anyone? I see a hand up. Yes. Before we start, yes, would you like to say what was?
So this is Mary Fee and John Courtnidge from the Occupy Economics Working Group.
Okay, we're not actually, when you speak, people can introduce themselves. We haven't really got time to go around everyone for introductions at the moment. Thank you. So I'd like to then start by inviting Steve Keen to say a few words about what he thinks has been the impacts of the Nobel Prize for Economics, or and what should happen to it.
Okay, well, thanks, Henry. Very briefly, I think everybody who's in this group is probably aware that the Nobel Prize in Economics is not a Nobel Prize in Economics. It was established by the Swedish Central Bank in 1969, and according to some people who are more experts on the history than I am, largely as a reaction by the conservatively run central bank against the socially democratic government at the time, with the objective of promoting a market-oriented, neoclassical, in practice, approach to economic theory. And it's been going for 50 years. If you look at the list of nominees, you can find one or two who are outside the mainstream, but fundamentally it's reinforced the mainstream approach to economics as strongly as their dominance of leading universities like Cambridge and Stanford and so on have done in the academic profession. And the public who is not aware of the actual history behind this institution tends to regard this as giving the same legitimacy as getting an award in physics. What I want to do, if I can successfully do this, I tried earlier today without much success, but let's see if we can do it more happily this time. I'll try to quickly share my screen here because I'm showing the physics prizes for the last decade or so on the left-hand side of the screen. Can you see that?
Yes, I think it's up there.
Okay, and on the right-hand side, the economics prizes. And if you take a close look, what you'll find is that predominantly the prizes in physics are awarded for actual experiments actual technology and theoretical ideas that have been verified by experimental data. So notice, for example, here I'm sure you all know the 2018 prize went to somebody for the invention of optical tweezers. No, I didn't know, but that's something that is real. Take a look at the LIGO, one of the gravitational wave investigation technology, which is now being used quite successfully to find gravitational waves as a way of analysing the universe. Probably the one people most aware of is the one of Peter Higgs. Now, Peter Higgs got the prize in 2013. Why did he get the prize in 2013 when he'd done the research to propose the existence of what's called the Higgs boson that gives fundamental particles their mass? And why did he take so long? Because it took until 2012, 2013 for its existence to be verified. Then the prize was awarded. Now, if you take a look at the economics prizes, what's rewarded is fundamentally contributions to mainstream economic theory. You get a few exceptions. They are getting it for contribution to behavioural economics, but fundamentally, what's over here and contract to some extent Angus Deaton giving an empirical basis there, but fundamentally it's people adding to theory. So you get Roth and Shapley for the theory of stable allocations and the practice of market design, Sargent and Sims, who gave us the real business cycle models, which are entirely a theoretical construct despite the mention of empirical work here. And probably my favorite, which I think you're all aware of, is the prize in 1997 given to Merton and Scholes for the method of determining the value of derivatives. 1 year later, the firm they created out of that, long-term capital management, virtually destroyed the financial system. So rather than experimentally verified, it was experimentally contradicted. And to me, the absolute pinnacle of this was the award last year of the prize to William Nordhaus, allegedly for integrating climate change into long-run macroeconomic analysis. Now, if you take a look at what Nordhaus did, what you'll find is him arguing that the optimal temperature level for the planet is 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This is a slide for a talk I'm giving at the OECD in a few weeks' time. And if you look at what he calls his optimal trajectory here, it actually peaks with the temperature being 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2140. If you talk a look and see what scientists are saying, what that world would be like, a set of climate scientists said, well, could we live in a 4-degree warmer world? And they are going, yes, 1 billion of us could. The other 6.5 billion are going to have to go somewhere else. In other words, it's completely contradictory to what science is arguing about what's likely to happen with climate change. And when you take a close look, as I have at Nordhaus's work, it is garbage. Neoclassical economists should disown this work. It is terribly badly done, including in one case fitting one of his functions to data, including a data point of his own, where the data point was wrongly recorded, and he didn't even realize that he was fitting it to a wrongly specified piece of his own data. And out of this, we've had a complete travesty. It's maintained the mainstream economic thinking at the exclusion of criticism of the mainstream and the exclusion of non-orthodox thought. And I think 50 years is enough. We should now call for it to be terminated.
Thanks very much, Steve. Well, that is a very strong case for the prosecution, if you like. Stephany, can I ask you now to put your views, please?
We're not hearing you, Stephany. Is she muted? So she's got her phone muted. Stephany, you have your phone muted. Go down the bottom left-hand corner and you'll see a button. You should see a button on the screen for your phone.
No.
Oh, yeah, now that's better. Yeah.
Yeah? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm delighted to be here. Such a privilege, such an important meeting. I would like to first start because I think one of the key questions you were asking now and in the morning was what are the main aims, what are the main criteria that Nobel Prize or any prize winners should have. And I sort of was thinking that I think it is to respond and building on what Ann Pettifer said this morning, is to respond to the main challenges of our time, to the main challenges that our society faces. And I would think there may be four. I think the first one is mitigating and adapting to climate change, thinking through what are the structural, the institutional, the policy challenges to reach a world where the economy is consistent with the needs of the planet, including shaping the financial sector, on which both Steve and I have worked a lot. I think the second one is how to reduce poverty and how to improve income distribution. I think the third one is how can you have structural changes so that we can restore growth, but growth that is both inclusive and consistent with the limits of the planet. And finally, how can we have an international economic system in terms of trade, in terms of finance, in terms of money, that is consistent with countries being able to be governed in a way that allows people to have a better life. And so I would argue that, you know, we need a Nobel Prize or an economics prize, a Swedish Central Bank prize, that is responding to the major challenges of the society, which included the ones that I outlined, but there may be other important ones. And I think that broadly, not just in terms of the economics profession, we have an economics profession which is broadly dysfunctional to these aims, because economics has failed to respond to the major challenges, and if anything, has contributed, including with examples that Steve gave, to undermine, for example, financial stability rather than promote it. And so I think particularly disappointing has been the fact that since the global financial crisis, teaching at the universities, with very few exceptions, you know, the Steve Keens, the Joe Stiglitzes, are very, very few. And most of the schooling in economics is still done with the sort of traditional neoclassical economics, which has been shown not to be very helpful in many aspects. But I want to be a little bit provocative and to challenge a little bit. I agree with the examples of bad economists who have got Nobel Prizes in economics, or so-called Nobel Prizes. But there, and I would add others, like Hayek got it, Milton Friedman, who wrecked my country, Chile, or helped wreck it in the 70s. People like Gary Becker, also from Chicago. There are a number of people who have had damaging effects of their theories. But I think they're also the good guys, and they are unfortunately mainly guys. But they have had very positive effects, and I have been privileged to work with one of them, Joseph Stiglitz. And I think Joseph Stiglitz, for example, has made very important contributions to economic theory. At the same time, he has been very closely, after he got his Nobel particularly, involved in economic policy making, on the whole, with a very progressive impact, advising, for example, many developing country governments, advising the Clinton administration in a number of positive ways, and interacting also a lot with civil society, because policies also are influenced by civil society. And you refer to this book that I had the honor to co-edit with him. And the reason why we called it Time for a Visible Hand is because Stiglitz always jokes that the reason why we can't see the invisible hand is because it's not there, which is a sort of, if you like, simple way of and popular way of undermining one of the basic assumptions of neoclassical economics, that there is this invisible hand of the market that tends to solve problems, but often it doesn't solve problems precisely because it's not there. But I mean, I was looking at the list of Nobel Prize winners, and there were a number of people who I think have made important contributions, like Arthur Lewis, like Gunnar Myrdal, like Akerlof, like Krugman, like Bob Schiller, like Kindleberger, James Tobin. A number of them have also been quite progressive in the policy advice. For example, I had the privilege also of meeting James Tobin, and he invented this idea of, well, following on the footsteps of Keynes, of having a financial transaction tax or a currency transaction tax, as he called it then. So there have been, a number of good, I think, policy proposals and good ideas that have also come out of Nobel Prize winners. So I think not all is dark, but I do agree very strongly that this prize should be improved, and that it should be broadened in terms of the kind of economists who are given the prize. It should certainly change its gender balance, because it's absolutely appalling that only one woman has won it after so many years. And it should also broaden very much in terms of disciplines. It's done a bit of that by awarding to people like Kahneman, but it should be much more open. I often find that when I talk to political scientists or sociologists, they know more economics than a lot of my economist colleagues. So I think it's a very good idea to introduce particularly political elements. And I think it's also excellent that you're launching this idea of not the Nobel Prize, where you will be more a challenger. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't be so much focusing on just criticizing the Nobel Prize, although I think it's very important, the distinction that you have made, that Nobel himself wouldn't endorse it, and the Nobel family is actually against the use of his name, as was outlined this morning. But I think the idea that you're thinking of an alternative one is very good, because it will provide a challenge, and hopefully it will lead to an improvement of making a Nobel Prize that is more relevant, or a Swedish Central Bank Prize that is more relevant, and that will be more helpful in shifting the economics profession to serving society, instead of the society serving the economists and the narrow groups that are behind the current thinking of economics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephany. That was a great sort of opening session. Now, I would like at this point to ask people if they'd like to make a comment, to ask a question. Keep it reasonably short. We don't have a lot of time, and I will ask people, sort of cut people off. I have the power to mute people. That's not one I want to use. But if people could hold their hand up electronically by going to manage participants, I can see hands coming up there, and I will unmute people. And if they could, people could introduce themselves and then make a point or ask a question. Thank you. Okay, Guy.
Yeah, hi there.
Hi,
I'm
Guy.
unmuted. Greetings.
Greetings.
From Western Canada. My thoughts around this are really relating to the supposition that a Nobel Prize implies that economics is a science. And we all know that in order to make that pretense, just close that thing off the desk there, in order to make that pretense, all sorts of neoclassical assumptions were made in the late 1800s around Homo economicus, and led to a completely false set of understandings, which is the biggest confusion for most people around economics. And the other Nobel Prizes, there's one for literature, which got into a hell of a mess last year, and there's one for peace, which has managed to stay non-political. As soon as you take economics out of being a science, it's a study of anthropology, really. It's a subset of anthropology. Then you're inevitably caught up with human values, with politics. And I can see a danger that if all the prizes went to the progressive left-wing economists, people would say, well, the Nobel Prize has been taken over by the communists or the socialists. So you get straight into that political dimension. And yet clearly we need recognition of the major contributions to solving the world's problems, the very list that Stephany put down and more. And so we need some way to acknowledge that, as well as the Nobel Peace Prize. So I'm just caught in this dilemma of how much we allow the continued acknowledgement that economics is a science, and start becoming honest that actually it's not a science in the normal sense of science. Thanks.
Thanks, Guy. And I think I might go back because Stephany, I mean, you mentioned some worthy winners, but I suppose this generic question of does the sort of, I suppose, the association with Nobel give it this sort of pseudo-scientific authority, which is dangerous in itself. And I know the student movement, their big complaint of the creation of the econocracy, of a sort of technicalizing it, moving it away from people so that it reduces their ability to engage with the subject.
Well, I think one of the important things to say is, and I think we try to do this, for example, at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University, where I'm actually a professorial fellow, an emeritus one. That's just because I'm so young. I think what we try and do is to show that there are different schools of economics thought, which in itself shows that there isn't one science, a pure science. I think there's some degree of indeterminacy even in physics, but there are much more empirical evidence. I think that in the case of economics, it's a sort of cross between arts and science. In the UK, they call it an art. In other countries, they call economics a science. When I studied economics in Chile, I got a degree as a commercial engineer. Nobody would call me an engineer here, and I think it's too pretentious, as the question said. So I think we have to recognize that social sciences are different, but that we can contribute, that experts can contribute to knowledge, and if we teach outright how economics changes according to the theory and also according to the circumstances. Arthur Lewis, for example, showed how economics was different in developing countries than it was in rich countries. So we have a variety of experiences in that sense.
Thanks, Stephany. So, Steve, in Britain, we've had enough of experts. Doesn't this just reinforce the sort of authority of people and the removal of a sort of democratic mandate?
I think this is the problem with economics being treated as something which has experts in it. As I said, economists are not experts on the economy in the same way that physicists are experts on the physical universe. Economists are experts on a model of the economy, and the only model that gets recognition predominantly, despite some of the good people that Stephany mentioned, is the neoclassical model. So what you get is a reinforcement of that model. Now, because that model has been spectacularly wrong, for example, promoting austerity as a way of getting an economy to recover from an economic crisis, which was caused by a financial bubble that they ignored, which was pointed out by Hyman Minsky that they also ignored. What you get is, I think, a large part of the distrust of expertise that we have these days literally is caused by economics itself, and it's justified. The trouble is that then washes over to other genuine sciences where that distrust of experts is not justified, climate change being probably one of the major examples. So I think we by treating ourselves as experts, this whole idea that economics is a science, if economics was engineering, then there'd be bridges collapsing all over the planet. And that would bring into genuine disrepute the building of builders of bridges. So what we've done is actually enhance the undermining of the value of expertise when our society desperately depends upon that expertise.
But let's just imagine we had this brave new world where there was still a Nobel Prize in economics, but it recognized a whole diversity of thinking, diversity of gender, race, and so on. It would still suggest that some people had special expertise. And is that a good thing? It would still associate that expertise with the sort of other Nobel Science Prizes.
I think it's be useful to encourage diversity in both of race, of sex, and of intellectual endeavor in economics, and basically say it's a pre-science, and we'd be rewarding people who are contributing by clearing away the nonsense in some cases, by developing alternative ways of thinking about the economy apart from the Ptolemaic nature of neoclassical economics, that would be worthwhile. But I think we have to see it as something which, in that sense, is more like the prize for literature than it is the prize for a science. It's something if you're making a contribution, but you still have to admit we're in a pre-scientific stage. And that's the economics profession itself will regale at that, but I think not the Nobel Prize is a good way of making that case while still saying we want to reward people for progressing us ever so slightly towards something that might resemble an economic science.
I think, for example, if you look at people like Keynes, he was very much very broadly formed. He knew a lot about statistics, about philosophy, about history, and very often the people who make the biggest contributions to solving problems of a particular society are those that understand the reality in which they're based. So I think we don't, in some ways, economics, if it was good, would be almost richer than a science because it could incorporate different cultures, human values, a specific historical context to deliver solutions. So, and I think what is very important, and it occurred to me just now listening to Steve, is to clarify that not all economists are neoclassical economists, because often when people are attacking economists, they're attacking neoclassical economists. But we can do better than that. We are not all neoclassical, and those of us who aren't can offer a contribution. So I think this distinction is very important. And of course, as you mentioned, the students are calling out desperately for all this. There is this movement in the UK, but also worldwide, where students realize that the kind of economics that's being taught has no relevance to the real world. So I think we have allies in that.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to now call on Tom McCallum. I'm trying to unmute it.
Hi there. So can you all hear me okay?
Yes, Tom, thanks.
No, thanks. Okay, so I'm an amateur. I'm not an economist. I'm the one in the audience when these guys are on panel discussions. I'm also a coach and I listen for context. So a couple of thoughts around this endeavor is we're not, in terms of diversity of thought, I don't feel we're thinking broadly enough about what we mean by economics as a starting point. So if what we mean by economics is, for example, allocating resources for the betterment of society, right? For example, like some kind of definition. You want it to be scientific, like making the toothpick that Steve was talking about earlier, then some of the people who may be achieving things in this won't be economists, right? So they might be Paul Polman, for example, who got kicked out of Unilever, right, for actually trying to better the world. It might be Rose Macario from Patagonia, right? So it could be business leaders who actually have the resources to deploy. It could be politicians who actually led their country in a certain direction. So if we're actually moving beyond academia, which in terms of lack of diversity of thought, I mean, Steve's been there. I attend Kilconomics every year. 95% of people there are neoclassical economists, almost everybody there, with only a few exceptions, are actually professional academic economists. So that's wonderful, and that's expertise. I'm just encouraging you to get clear for the Not the Nobel Prize. What do we mean by economics? Because I haven't seen that anywhere written down. As what does that endeavor mean by economics? And do you want skin in the game, as the rather confrontational Mr. Taleb would talk about? Right, so that's just a couple of thoughts as the direction you could go in. So if I'm looking to nominate people, it wouldn't be the estimable Miss Rayworth or Mazzucato or others, because they're academic economists. I think it's like, if you want to go different, go different. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm just going to go back to so yeah, what is an economist, Stephany? Or maybe what is someone who actually can help us with designing an economy that actually works for us?
I think it's a very good question. As I sort of hinted before, I think that it's people who can help, as you said, solve the economic problems of society. And I think that economists have something to contribute in that. And I think they do have some technical expertise. I think some instruments like evaluating projects, although maybe not perfect, are useful. But there are also other people. I mean, I think the engineers who designed solar panels have probably done more to climate mitigation than lots of economists who just talk about it. So I would agree that engineers or lawyers or business people or trade union or ordinary workers who help improve the working of a factory with their suggestions, as they do in Japan, for example, may also be improving the economy. And maybe there is like too much deification of economics as a solution to our problems. So I think the more modest we become, the more we accept the limitations of our profession, particularly as it is now, we may learn and incorporate other knowledge into our thinking and into our practice. For example, I've been studying a lot of national development banks, national investment banks, like the ones that the Labour Party would like to create in the UK. And some of the best people there are engineers because they understand the sectors in which they work, they understand where the technology is going. And I think that's extremely valuable. So I agree that incorporating other professions to solving economic problems is a great idea.
Thank you very much. Steve, who should we look to?
Okay. If I can, just before Guy dives in, I'd give my definition of economics as being the study of the human system of production and distribution. And in that sense, yes, it's quite true that engineers could contribute a lot more than economists have to that particular area. I think my favorite engineer nomination would be J. Forrester, of course, long since deceased. Actually, not all that long deceased, but somebody who should have been awarded it for new ways to think about the economy, which, of course, neoclassical economists drove out, most notably William Nordhaus.
Okay, let's go to Guy. You're holding up your hands.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of things. One is, I believe this is the second of your webinars, and I couldn't join the early one because it's on 10 in the morning on the west coast of Canada, but I believe you have people like Anne Pettifor, and I'd be interested to know what their thoughts were for our group. And the second one is, I don't want to see us throw babies out with bathwater. I mean, Steve, you talk about we shouldn't be proud of being experts, but frankly, your analysis of private debt to GDP ratios is far more useful for thinking about the future of financial crashes than the stuff that Reinhardt and Rogoff did, which led to the let's do austerity all round. We need that kind of expertise. So there's some very serious head thinking work going on by economists, even if they're not in the neoclassical school. I mean, in fact, because they're not in the neoclassical school.
This is the frustration for me that I'm seeing people who are doing garbage work like Nordhaus getting the prize for extending garbage. When you're trying to do worthwhile and sensible stuff, you don't even get listened to. And that's why I say the Nobel Prize itself should go. And I love Henry's idea of not the Nobel, at least to provide a satirical side effect to the annual award of pomp and ceremony to people whose work is, the old classic statement from Shakespeare, sound and fury signifying nothing.
Who else out there who hasn't spoken yet would like to give a perspective? I'll just pick up one of the comments that's come through on the chat about the Right Livelihood Award. There are a range of other prizes around, obviously. I suppose what is particular about what we're doing is that we are on purpose going head to head with the Nobel Prize for Economics. Because we want to really use the 50-year anniversary to raise issues around the nature of economics, whether it's a science, the history of the Nobel Prize, which itself is quite dodgy, and also because it's going to be it's a sort of people's prize, and this is on purpose because, again, sort of contrasting with the Nobel Economics Prize, which is very elitist and secretive. to have something open that anyone can give their view to, and using that to illustrate, I suppose, the belief that we think economics, because it's about values and about how we think the world should be, people generally should have a say about what good economics is. So I think there's particularities to what we're doing, and we recognise that other people have done similar things. In terms of what Anne Pettifor said, I suppose one of the points she made was that, you know, we can see by the world around us and the nature, inequality, heading for environmental crisis and so on, that economists, or at least that design of our economies, have been a fundamental failure, even if actually proving a particular theory or not is problematic. Of course, Nicholas Gruen made a reasonable comment, was that it might be easy to see what's not working. Trying to determine exactly what will work if it's not been tried before is more problematic. And in a way, you can't prove it. You actually have to try it and go with it. And you get proven wrong maybe later. But there you go. We've got a question. Someone's put a question in the chat for Steve. How much did the Nobel that Milton Friedman received influence the way central bankers work? And also what we today called neoliberalism, from Milos?
I think an enormous amount. I don't know how many people here have done an economics degree at any point in their lives, but if you happen to be the recalcitrant student who doesn't accept the theory, virtually the first thing that come back to you when you criticize an assumption, oh, assumptions don't matter. That's the universal reply to anybody critiquing an assumption. And you're then told that if you don't like the assumptions, wait a while, later on in life we remove that assumption and make it much more realistic. This future promise of taking away the abstractions is always made. When you actually read the literature, you realize that what's assumed at the higher levels is stuff that makes the stuff assumed at the lower level look realistic. I mean, my favorite being in William Sharpe theory of the efficient markets hypothesis. He developed a very simplistic but nonetheless coherent theory of how an individual investor might decide to allocate his or her income or investment funds between a riskless asset and a portfolio of risky assets, where the basically shares gave different. You had the portfolio was a distribution of expectations of the annual return and the volatility of that return for each share. And then stuck with the problem that he couldn't work out how to go from individual to a collective, he said, let's just assume homogeneity of investor expectations. Investors are assumed to agree about the returns for all shares and their volatility. And he then said, needless to say, this is an extreme assumption. However, since it implies what I believe in the first place, paraphrasing him, let's go with it. And so you had a theory of stock market price formation, which of course failed empirically drastically. And even Fama came along and said that back in about 2004, and trying to explain why the theory failed. Finally, Fama looks at the assumptions and points out not only did he assume homogeneity of expectations, he also assumed those expectations were correct. So the efficient markets hypothesis was based on the hypothesis that we can all predict the future accurately. Now, this stuff gets sanitized by textbooks, and people never see it quite in that extreme grounding unless they actually read the original papers. So in the same sense that textbooks give a cover for absurd neoclassical, not simplifying assumptions, but fantasies, which are then used to push the theory, to get the theory over logical conundrums. The Nobel Prize does the same thing. So the fact that it's given to somebody seems to legitimize their thought in the eyes of the public. And then, 1 year later, in the case of Merton and Scholes, we find the whole thing blows up in their face. The reason that I think the 50th anniversary is the time to say enough for this charade, and let's actually, if not shut it down, at least point it out that it is a charade with not the Nobel, is giving it to Nordhaus. Because I think when humanity looks back, what's left of humanity looks back, as a century in the future, and says, what led us into this absolute hellhole? The answer would be William Nordhaus and his colleagues in climate economics, who spent 50 years delaying us taking any action on climate change because they didn't believe, first of all, they didn't believe it was going to be, they're basically climate change trivializers. And secondly, they didn't want any mechanisms that weren't market mechanisms. When you look at the scale of change involved in actually preventing ecological crisis, the market would never cut it. So for the sake of preserving the market, they're going to destroy humanity. And that's enough reason to say enough for this particular year.
Can I also answer the question about Milton Friedman, and I think ways that complement what Steve has just so eloquently said? Is that all right?
Yes, go for it, Stephany.
When General Pinochet and the military took over power in Chile in the 1970s, they didn't really know what to do in the economy, and they called these Chicago boys. And Milton Friedman and other of the leading Chicago economists actually spent quite a lot of time in Chile advising the government with absolutely disastrous results. I mean, the economy plunged, unemployment reached record levels. When it reached 20%, General Pinochet said that the statistics office had to assure that it wouldn't go on rising, so we don't know exactly how much it was. Real wages plummeted, and so on. So this was perhaps the most blatant example of economics being abused by the powerful in a repressive way to suppress working class people, to lower wages, to impose absolutely draconian austerity. And this was led by this Nobel Prize winner, Milton Friedman. So I wanted to maybe stress also the ethical dimension of economics, because to the extent that economics has a lot of influence on policy making, or policymakers, it should also be ethically based. And I just anecdotally want to tell that I studied economics in Chile, and my first lecturer in the Catholic University, which I left and discussed after, was a guy who then became minister under Pinochet. And he, in the first class, said that economics is the study of allocating scarce resources to multiple users. And he said, for example, the problem that a beggar has is the same one as a millionaire, he said, because if the beggar has 100 pesos and has to decide whether to buy a piece of bread or a bottle of milk for his child, whereas the millionaire, his scarce resource is time. So he has to decide whether to go sailing for the next week or to travel to Europe for a nice holiday in Europe. And he said this in a classroom full of 100 kids, undergraduates. And when I heard him, I realized that he was completely mad. And he actually did more to make me a lefty than anybody else. So I think that he was extreme, but this is what a lot of these neoclassical economists think. So I think we have to go back to the ethical foundation, what economics and what economic policy making is for. It's to maximize well-being for the majority of people. And I wanted to finish this comment by saying something about the underlying politics, because I think that although the economists, of course, have a lot of fault, and those that have these extreme views in particular, but underlying them are vested interests. And I think one of the reasons why we have such power in neoclassical economics is, for example, the power of the financial sector, because it suits the private financial sector to say that financial markets are efficient. I mean, obviously it's a joke, we know that. But even in progressive places, after the financial crisis, I heard so-called progressive colleagues say to me, but we can't tax financial markets, we can't impose a Tobin tax, because financial markets are efficient. And I said, don't you read what's happening in the world, one crisis after another? So many jobs destroyed, so many livelihoods destroyed. But even these intelligent people were not realizing. But this is not promoted in a neutral way just by academics. It's also promoted by the vested interests that are gaining from this, because you have to look at who is gaining and who is losing. And I think clearly large economic interests, and particularly the dominant financial interests, are gaining from the support from the support of these economic ideas. And so it's excellent if you're promoting alternative ideas and mobilizing thinking and social forces behind it so that they can come up with alternative economic policies and economic thinking.
Thanks, Stephany. Now there's one last request from Guy. If you keep it quick, and
Yes.
then we'll move to, I'll talk about the process of nominating and voting and so on.
Yeah, very briefly, Henry. I know Jacob van Exkel, who founded the Right Livelihood Award, and I follow their awards every year, and they get no publicity in the proper media. Your idea of calling it not the Nobel Prize is going to, I think the media are going to love the idea of a bit of a shitstorm going on between academics and experts, and it's going to really piss off the neoclassical economists. And it could have a day or two of getting some proper focus on what is really quite an obscure area of paradigm construction. And so if as well as the announced winner and their work, we have a clear explanation of why people like Nordhaus absolutely do not deserve to get the prize, and the phoniness of the prize, that it's not set up by a proper Nobel committee, it's coming out of the bank. I think it's a really great way of advancing the debate by sticking with the not the Nobel Prize emphasis and just stirring up a shitstorm in the media. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that support, Guy. We are trying to do both and. So we are trying to challenge, question the Nobel Prize as well as the positive side. And so we will have a series of blogs, which hopefully will get a lot of reading. We're hopefully getting into the media and so on. So yeah, I hope you're right. We have a slight problem here in the UK called Brexit, which is taking up all the space in all the media. So this has slightly reduced our ability to actually get any coverage, but we'll keep trying. Steve, do you want to say just a last word? I think Stephany, you covered quite a lot of ground, and hopefully have sort of got a lot of points over it. Steve wants to say a last thing, and then I will go and share a screen and show how the nomination process works and how you can add your ideas and propositions.
Okay. Let me say one very brief practical suggestion. I understand that the Economics Prize is given to people who are only people who are alive.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering whether you would consider opening up your prize, because I think that like giving the economics, you're not the Nobel Prize to people like Keynes or Minsky or Joan Robinson, for example, could have quite a lot of value.
Thanks. We've certainly thought about that. We've sort of thought of doing maybe a separate one for, or having a separate category for people who are not alive, maybe. We'll see how we go there. But yeah, thanks. Steve.
Okay, just quickly, I'll do another share screen if you can cope with doing it once more. And that is just to, I mean, when I answered the question before I did Milton Friedman, I ignored the monetary stuff, which may have been the point of view of the questioner. I think without a doubt, he had a major impact on central banks, but that was already happening back in 1971. Speaking of my experience as a student at the time, so the prize consolidated. It didn't give him that wasn't the only reason. But I think what Milton Friedman really did is the quote I've got on screen right now, because if I look at what's the most tragically bad stuff that Nordhaus has done, it's assuming that they can use geographic data about temperature and GDP to predict what's going to happen when the climate increases the temperature of the planet by 4 degrees, as he recommends as the optimal level. And it's this disease of believing that the more unrealistic your assumption, the better the theory. And funnily, if I went back and checked the original Milton Friedman on this front and spotted a footnote that I myself hadn't read before because I regarded the whole thesis as nonsense. But here's the footnote. The converse does not hold. Assumptions that are unrealistic do not guarantee a significant theory. Now, the trouble is because nobody reads footnotes, including this time me, neoclassical economists have gone with the text, ignored the footnote, and what you've got is almost a competition between them to come up with the most absurd bloody assumptions as a hallmark of being a neoclassical economist. When it's come to climate change and assuming you can use current GDP temperature data to predict what's going to happen when you turn up the temperature on the planet by 10 degrees, it's going to doom us all. And I think that's really the main disease it's created, this disease of believing that you can make a fantasy as a simplifying assumption when you get a logical problem in your derivation of some esoteric neoclassical idea. So yes, it's time just to call a halt and say, you know, you've got to learn the difference between a simplifying assumption and a fantasy. And if we've got to get away with 50 years of fantasy, now's the time to stop it.
Thanks, Steve. Can you unshare your screen? Great.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I'm now going to go to share my screen and take you to our web page firstly, if I can find it. Our website's economicpluralism.org. So this you'll find on the home page, not the Nobel Prize. Go in, then we've got a page with lots of sort of explanations of why we're doing it, how, the timetable, the fact that we're doing 2 stages of voting. So the first voting, everyone can nominate, vote, discuss, and then the top 3 get moved into a new phase where there's only 3 you can just vote on. And that will happen somewhere around the 23rd of September. And then the final event on Thursday, the 3rd of October. So, which is going to be live streamed around the world. So the first stage, get involved here from our website, not the Nobel Prize page. And if you click that, you go to another online platform where then you will have to register here to be part of it, and then you can add new ideas. Now here, a new idea means a new person or people, or even possibly an organization. And so far we've had 2 nominations, which are not totally surprising, for Kate Rayworth and Mariana Mazzucato. If you add one, and anyone can, you need to add some sort of title, so name or names, so people know what you're talking about, and then an explanation, what was the nature of their innovation, how did it contribute to humankind. Now remember, this is both thinkers and doers. You can upload an attachment to give further explanation if you want to. You can add also further points for your nomination. Location, so give the location of the people or organization. Media, you can upload an image. If it's a person, a photo would be good of them, obviously. A video, you can upload a video that you make, or upload a speech, so you can talk about the person. And then you hit create. Once they're created, they will sit here, and other people then can come along, and if they open them like that, they can add points for or against. They can also, the points that's been made already, they can move them up. So if I go like that, I sort of up that point and make it more important, or that one, and I take it down. And I can even put points against. And you can also vote. And voting is either giving love, vote the idea up, or vote the idea down. So that means the actual people, and that will contribute to the question of who gets into the last 3 for voting. So I'll leave that open. Has anyone got any questions? If people unmute themselves and ask the question, I'll keep sharing. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, it's Guy here, very simply. How can each person only vote once? How do you prevent vote stacking and multiple voting and the normal rigging of the market that goes on?
You can only vote once for each person. You could vote for a number of people. Obviously, the more you vote for, the less significant your vote is, as such. And you can vote up for some and down for others. You can put points in as many places as you like. Yeah, people can't vote loads of times. So there I showed that I voted once, my vote's counted. I try and vote again, it disappears. And you have to register with it. You have to sign in and log in. So, and you have to give a name and so on. Any other questions? We've got a comment here coming in on the chat line. That's about the economics, so we'll leave that.
Yep.
Any questions about the panel, the voting platform?
Oh, the voting platform is, hang on, how do I unmute myself? Voting platform is very good, I think, Henry. It's extremely well designed. I take it as one up and one down. You can't do more than one. You can't click more than once for an up or a down.
No,
of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've got a little video on it, which I quite like. There's Nobel fail. It fades out, and then we have to find our own economic thinkers and doers. So it's fairly straightforward, but it does allow a bit of discussion, and it allows we can have as many nominations. I hope we'll have a huge diversity. We want doers. We've got two on the more thinking side, though I suppose Kate's also a great communicator. But we really could do, as Thomas suggested, more doers, people acting in the world to create economies that have the shape that we need to deal with the 21st century challenges we face. And I'd be really grateful if you've got some ideas, mull over it this evening and get to it immediately, because we're about to launch it more widely, and it'd be great to have a range, a diversity of nominations as new people come on and start voting. Do be specific. Someone put up a proposition which was a sort of more like an idea that various people to a greater or lesser extent have contributed to and so on. I know it's sometimes difficult to tie down, and you could nominate a group of people you think are all being major players. So then at least you know there's a group of specified people and who sort of could jointly end up with the prize. But be specific so we know who is being nominated.
So Henry, when are you going public with this so that we get? I want the deadlines. You know, when do we need to get it stacked up by?
Over this evening, tomorrow morning, we will start. We'll see how many. We hope to go broader across social media in the next day or so. We've only got 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks, to get all the voting nominations done. So we really need a greater range and diversity of nominations in the next 24 hours, so we can then go out to a much wider set of people, and they come in and see that there's something going on here, if you like. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking part, and I look forward to having all your nominations and seeing how this goes. And I think we should hopefully get some really interesting suggestions of where really useful, interesting stuff is going on. So I look forward. I hope you all keep in touch, and we'll be giving updates, and we'll be putting stuff on social media. Do share stuff on social media.
And Henry?
Yeah.
One final thing.
Yeah.
There once was a wonderful webinar whose participants wanted to think afar, but while they were muted, their thoughts were transmuted and soon became cosmically nebula.
Thank you very much, Guy. That's a great point to end on. And thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks very much, Stephany. I'm sorry about the technical challenges, but we got there in the end. Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye, all.
Bye.